Hi, my name is David Margol, and I'd like to welcome you to another edition of Forecast Contest Tips and Tricks. In today's edition, we're going to focus on some of my forecast strategies. And I think what we're going to do here is we're going to have a multi-part series, and we're going to start with my most recent forecast that I put out for the medium range period, the 16 to 28 day period, on Tuesday morning as part of the forecast contest. So, a little bit about my forecast process before I show you some of the maps and some of the steps I went through. Uh, I like to get in touch with the weather guidance, and in particular, look at the forecast for the next 15 days. So, despite the fact I'm making a forecast for the 16 to 20, I want to see what's going on now, and I want to see what's going on over the next 15 days. So, for example, are there any major blocking patterns? Are there any major tropical storms in the Atlantic or in the West Pac or East Pac even? And are there any major winter storms? So, why am I looking at these things? Because in some cases, these things could have I think, a material impact on numerical guidance performance and risks to the forecast. For example, if there's potential for a major winter storm, say 5, 6, 7 days out for the Northeast, those are scenarios where historically, based on my experience, the model's numerical guidance don't resolve that well, especially beyond 3 or 4 days. So there's a lot of room for change. A much stronger storm, much weaker storm, a lot more snow across the Northeast, a lot less snow, and then of course downstream impacts even to the North Atlantic blocking pattern. Much stronger storm might be able to create a more disruptive or more negative NAO, and so on. So that's why, or at least part of the reason why I like to get in touch with weather. In addition to that, I like to review some of the large scale features, such as ENSO or El Nino, some of the slightly smaller tropical forcing signals, such as MJO. In the wintertime, stratospheric signals, such as sudden stratospheric warmings or sudden stratospheric coolings. These are events or type of events that can have significant and or long-term impacts on the atmosphere. And in some cases, again, based on my experience, and some of this is subjective and some of this is more objective, that the model's numerical guidance may not resolve these features well. So it's important to know what's going on, and then you can include or incorporate that thinking into your forecast. All right. I also like to look at or make a review of performance metrics. The more, the better, right? In some of our other tools and tips, we talked about how important it is to have performance metrics. Well, I like to start off by looking at the short-term metrics. Have there been recent biases in the models? How have they been performing compared to themselves, but also compared to climatology? And of course, if you have long-term metrics, all the better, right? Because we know there are some biases, long-term systematic biases in the models. One of the more classic known biases is that the GFS has a cold bias. And finally, of course, I like to see what other folks are saying. And there's a different school of thought or schools of thought on this, but at the end of the day, I think within reason, you want to see what others are thinking, in particular groups that you respect, or have a different way of maybe looking at things, and may use different data points. At the end of the day, we're trying to make the best forecast possible. So whether that comes from your knowledge or from some other group who came up with a great idea or came up with some great new analysis or just figured something out, ultimately, for your decision, for your stakeholders, your goal is to provide the best forecast possible. So, it's okay and even encouraged to try to work with and solicit as much information that's out there, as long as it's benefiting, as long as you think it's benefiting your forecast. All right, so I mentioned that the first thing I'd like to do is get in touch. So thanks to our sponsor, Radiant, we've got some great graphics and numerical model graphics here that we can look at. For example, in many cases, I'll look at the ECMWF and the CFS 500 millibar height anomalies and the surface anomalies. Now, I'm just going to give you a quick tour just for the sake of time here, but these are the kinds of graphics that I typically look at. The 500 millibar gives me a nice overview of the mid and upper levels. And when I switch to the surface, which you can find here, that gives me a nice overview of the surface, of course, or the lower levels. And that can be really helpful and important because, sometimes you're going to have, like this winter, very significant widespread areas of cold. And similar to the kinds of things we talked about earlier, in some cases, models may not resolve large, significant pools of cold well. So that is something that I like to look at so that I can bake that into my forecast process. All right, so after I'm done kind of going through a review of what's going on, looking up locking patterns, things like that, I'll typically, as I mentioned, try to get a snapshot of some of the bigger scale things. And sometimes I'll use my site that you see here. There's also a lot of great public sources that are out there through NOAA and some other channels. But again, I like to look at the SST anomalies to get an indication of ENSO and things like that. I like to look at the MGO guidance or the RMM guidance that you can find here. I'll just click on it. If you're not familiar with this kind of diagram, this is an MGO projection or Wheeler-Hendon proxy for the MGO. So it's not exactly the MGO, but it's a proxy for it. And it shows where the MGO's been, where it is, and where it's forecast to go. And the forecast here is in green, and this forecast is from the ECMWF. And if you track the link here, you can go back and see a lot of other great information about the MGO. There's some other charts here too, which also can be helpful. After I'm done kind of looking at the subseasonal and ENSO signals, as I mentioned, a lot of times I'll try to take a look at the performance metrics. And we have some of these performance metrics now in our forecast tool. And you can grab them here if you go under the performance tab and see how see the recent performance of some of the different forecasters and some of the different guidance and things like that. Radiant also has some nice performance metrics to look at. So there's some other options there too. And then finally, as I mentioned, in many cases, I'll also look at some of the forecasts from groups like Radiant and others and kind of get a feel for what they're saying and see if there's perhaps something I missed or seeing how they're weighting things and considering things. And sometimes, if you have access even, it's great to pick up the phone and make a call. So that's my forecast process from earlier this week for the medium range period.